Big tech has been really taking away our rights of free speech. And there's a big argument right now over whether this is actually censorship in accordance with, say, the Bill of Rights. Here to talk with us about this is James Taylor. He's president of the Heartland Institute. And James, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
So why don't we start with a basic question. Can we call tech censorship a violation of your First Amendment rights?
Well, it's not so much a First Amendment issue as it is a free speech issue. Because remember, our free speech rights were not benevolently given to us by the Founding Fathers. They were recognized in the First Amendment, but our free speech rights are unalienable. They cannot rightfully be taken away from us by government or by any other entity. So the First Amendment applies to government and says government can't do this, but no private entity can either. Just as no burglar can come into my home and rightfully take my possessions, similarly, no private entity can come and take away my free speech rights simply because they're a private entity.
And this is one of the challenges we have, though, which is legally these organizations, I mean, maybe they can't. We'll have to see maybe how these lawsuits turn out, but there's a lot of arguments saying that they have the right to choose what they put on their platform and don't put on their platform, but they have such huge monopolies over our ability to communicate that it's very difficult to get around this.
Right. These aren't two or three companies competing to see who can build a better mousetrap, and one does it very well, and we should allow them to reap the fruits of their success. These are corporations that made a deliberate decision to enter into the realm of where free speech is conducted. Social media, this is the primary means by which people communicate with each other, political, cultural, religious ideas. So if these companies make a deliberate point to go into that realm, and especially if you're going to monopolize it, where you have the top three controlling 95% of social media traffic, then it's not unreasonable to say, hey, look, you're going into this realm where free speech is conducted. You should be held to allow speech to prevail. You should not be allowed to restrict and stifle free speech if you're going to go into that realm. That's not a property right. That's simply a free speech right.
And we're seeing this expand also. We're seeing in a very concerning overlap of government action influencing this type of censorship. And it really gets into a murky area politically and in terms of even possible actual violations of our First Amendment rights under the Bill of Rights, which is that if government is pushing for this type of censorship and then business is really just the arm of government, is that then a type of government censorship if they do it through the medium of private business?
Right, absolutely. Facebook and Twitter view themselves as the enforcement arm of government proclamations from the CDC or from the World Health Organization. And the Biden administration admits openly that they are in close, constant communication, flagging speech that they want to see removed, certain lines of argument, certain points of view that they want to see taken down, and then also arguing that if someone has been flagged for what they consider to be misinformation, that together all of the giant tech companies should permanently block such users. So yeah, just because they're a private company, if they are working deliberately, even if it wasn't deliberately, but in this case it is deliberately, as the enforcement arm of the government to impose upon our free speech rights, absolutely. Not only is this now a free speech issue, but as you mentioned, this would now become a First Amendment issue.
And we're seeing this expand now as well. This is another really concerning part of the way this is heading, which is that typically it's a step-by-step process. It's not like it goes on one thing and just ends there. Typically, you see government action begin in one area, expand to the next, and the next, the next, like the boiling frog analogy. And before you know it, they're doing things like censoring your SMS messages, which they're talking about doing right now, your text messages on your phone. There's talk now about, for example, making phone companies censor your ability to talk about like vaccine policy over your text messages.
Right. Yeah, and that's quite frightening. Sometimes people have said, well, it's still a public pronouncement, but now there are arguments being made, there's pressure being applied from including government officials for tech to look into your personal private text messages and therefore censor and potentially block and ban you as a result of that. This is especially pernicious. As I mentioned before, I want to expand upon this. Facebook alone controls 75% of social media traffic. And the top three tech companies in this realm control 95%. The top four control 98%. So people will say, well, if you don't like it, you can build your own company. Well, first of all, I can't build my own company. But if you want to say in general somebody can, I was sympathetic to that argument until, of course, Parler formed and then was destroyed after it started to mount a successful challenge. There is merely a shell of competition. It's less than 2%, and even they are subject to Facebook, Twitter, etc. The biggest problem here is that we have no other alternative. And those that exist are basically saying we are going to do what the CDC, the World Health Organization, CDC, Centers for Disease Control, and basically what government tells us, we are going to enforce it. That is not free speech in this country.
Now, in terms of ways to deal with this, what do we do at this point? Because they do have a monopoly, it's really, there's not a lot of action that's being taken seriously, it seems. Well, there's some lawsuits. But what do people do about this?
Right. Great question. And I think the best approach right now, the first thing that should be done but won't be done is that the federal government, Congress in particular, federal legislators will get involved, will make it clear. The big tech companies hide behind Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. They read it out of context. They apply it out of context. I think Congress should reaffirm that this does not give them blanket approval, blanket authority to censor anything they want. But short of that, because it won't happen, state legislators have the ability, both legally and politically, to create a cause of action that says if you are a tech corporation that has a dominant market share and you censor or block speech from our citizens, then there will be penalties for this. And the penalties can and should be sufficient enough to deter the tech companies from doing it in the first place. But there needs to be a legislative cause of action at the state level to do it. And hopefully our state legislators will step up for the citizens who they represent, who right now cannot communicate freely on the primary means by which people talk with each other in the 21st century.
Now, we're seeing an odd kind of shift of political stances on this, because usually it was the Bush-era Republicans who were very much against any kind of intervention against big business, and it was the Bush-era Democrats who were very much against big I mean, they still claim to be against big corporations and billionaires and stuff like this. But the big corporations and billionaires seem to be almost entirely on the side of the new socialist movement, which claims to oppose them. And the conservative side, which is different, I think, from the Republican Party it used to be, is really kind of not very happy with tyrannical government any more than it is tyrannical business.
Right.
It's such an interesting shift in terms of politics and private industry. How do you view this whole dynamic?
Well, and I guess it's a microcosm of the political shift we're seeing throughout the country, where you have populism becoming more of a defining factor, populism versus the state, as opposed to Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, etc. So in this regard, look, myself, I'm more libertarian than I am conservative. I'm kind of in the middle, but I'm more libertarian. I don't have a problem with companies that succeed gaining a large and even a dominant market share. The problem here, though, is that, again, it's not 2 or 3 companies dominating the mousetrap market. These are 3 corporations essentially working together to capture and then stifle free speech on the primary means by which we exercise our free speech rights. Free speech rights are unalienable by government or by corporations. That's where the problem is because they're stepping out of their bounds and they're taking away our individual rights.
And this is a different way of looking at, I think, what tyranny is. And I think this is kind of where the discussion in the country has been going, is that tyranny is not just government tyranny. Tyranny is any kind of dominating structure that can take away your rights. And yes, that can be cultural tyranny, that can be education tyranny, that can be media tyranny, that could be anything that has a monopoly and then uses that monopoly to try to kill competition from the private sector and try to use the powers they have to restrict the people who use those services and have no other choice.
Yeah, I have a very strong suspicion and in many ways a fear of government, because government has the capacity and often the inclination to take away our rights. They have the capacity to be large enough, and they also have the capacity to sometimes, for political reasons or whatever else. That's why I am especially afraid and concerned about an accumulation of power with government, and that's why I worry about them taking away our rights. But they are not the only entities that can do so. Like I mentioned earlier, a burglar doesn't have a right to come into my home and take my possessions. It is okay, it is appropriate, it is indeed necessary for government to have laws against private actors coming into my home and taking away my property rights. The same applies here. We have a few corporations, just really 3 of them, working together, controlling essentially all of the social media market.